Hello, I'm Denise Mina and welcome to this Book Week Scotland event in which I'm going to sit and monologue for about 30 minutes about my book, The Less Dead, which I've only got the American version left, which is a great sign because that means that people I know have asked me if they could have a copy, which is, sometimes I end up with millions of copies of a book and that's kind of embarrassing because clearly nobody said, oh, you need to read that, it's absolutely brilliant. But that hasn't happened with this one, so I'm kind of delighted with the way the book's gone. But the book is basically it's the story of a woman who goes to meet her birth family, and she's had a very happy adoption, and she's gone to an adoption agency and she's waiting for her family to turn up, and they don't turn up, and she's gone at their insistence. And I found that I heard about that in a podcast called Root of Evil, which was about a woman who flew to Hawaii, and this is like in the olden days when people would reconcile with their birth family in quite a disordered way, but I think it's much better organised now. And basically she flew to Hawaii with her baby, and then her birth family just didn't turn up for her, and they'd asked her to go, which was a big sign that the family there was a lot going on there. But I find that really interesting. I think for my generation, we often talk about your family of choice and who you choose to be your family as you grow up. And I wanted to sort of explore the idea of who belongs to you and who do you belong to. And the reason that it kind of started with a true crime case actually in the 1980s. And the 90s, right up till about 2001, I think, or 2002. There was a series of murders of sex workers in Glasgow, street sex workers. And these were women who were selling sex on the streets. And there was a very ambivalent attitude to those women. It was a very strange thing. In the feminist movement, there was a very strange attitude to those women. And, a lot of people said, oh, they're on drugs, they can't help themselves. But I knew some of those women and they could help themselves. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they were quite together, maybe addicted, but still quite together. And most of the women that I knew who did that job were doing it because they wanted to take drugs and they wanted to continue their addiction. It was just really interesting that we as feminists wouldn't take ownership of those women, that we didn't feel that they belonged to us, that we had to misunderstand or mishear their motives in order to find them in any way sympathetic. And a lot of those women, they were rough. And that again didn't really fit with the kind of victim attitude of the feminist movement. So that was really what it was about. It was about how can we take ownership and why do we feel that these women don't belong to us when they so clearly do. They're exactly who the feminist movement is for. Anyway, so this series of sex murders, all the way through the 1980s and 90s, a story kept coming up that it was a serial killer in Glasgow. And this absolutely amazing policewoman, Nanette Pollock, would come on television every so often and say, I just want everyone to know this is not a serial killer. These are just lots of different men doing this. And it's chaotic down there and it's very difficult to police. And, I just loved this woman so much. And at one point, nobody came forward when a woman had been killed in a particularly brutal way. This was a girl that I knew a lot of people who sold second-hand clothes and used to hang about paddies. My mum used to hang about paddies. My mum knew that girl and she knew girls that knew that girl. And so she was a face, do you know what I mean? The woman had been killed in a really quite brutal way. It was pretty horrific and no one came forward despite the fact that she was a well-known character in Glasgow. And Nanette Pollock went on television and she said, I want all the men to know that we know who you are, we've got your license plate number, and if you don't start coming forward and telling us what you know, we're going to come to your house and your place of work and we're going to ask you about it. And a whole big, there was a tsunami of men coming forward, and because that particular area, the red light area in Glasgow at the time, was just so busy. I mean, you would go down there at night and it was like a city within a city. There was people standing on street corners. There was the was it Salt and Light bus? There was a big bus that gave out soup and hot drinks and advice to these women. There was a wee cafe facility. There was a room that women used to go to, and they could go there. They could drop their bags. They could make a cup of tea. They could have you know, a shower or whatever. They could blow dry their hair, and if anything happened, they could go back there and report it. It was a safe place, and it was a place where people were passing on information about attacks and stuff like that. It was really fascinating. So anyway, they knew who these people were, but they just didn't want to come forward and talk about it, and they managed to get them to come forward and talk about it. And I was interested in Glasgow at that time and the attitude to sex workers in particular. Now, in crime fiction, that is a big issue, because in crime fiction, we have a thing we call the perfect victim. So if you're a victim and you're young, blonde, a virgin, that's best, middle class, and your parents are still together and they're very sad about the fact that you've died, that is the best victim you can have. But these women, anyone who varies from that, people of colour, you know, anyone who's morally ambivalent, anyone who comes from a broken home, those are difficult victims. And we can't, you know, as crime writers tend to assume that the audience won't care about them. And I think that's a mistake, because I think that is our audience. Because when you look out at an audience of crime fiction readers, it's everybody. It's not just white, blonde, Nazi-esque types, you know. And so I wanted to sort of look at why these women were not regarded as valid victims. And we often talk about the lack of policing around crimes that affect these people, but it's not just the police. That's the thing, is it's the public, and it's crime writers, and it's, you know, we value victims in different ways. And with the Black Lives Matter protest movement in the States, that really made me think about it, you know, that it takes a lot. Another thing that made me think about this was there was a new prize launched for crime fiction or thrillers. And it was a prize for the thriller that didn't focus on a crime of sexual violence against a young blonde victim. And it was an attempt to address that. And I think that was, you know, laudable. It was the right question, but I think it was the wrong answer, because the problem isn't with crime fiction. The problem is with us as a society and what we value as a society. So I wanted to kind of address that and look at why, you know, we feel we can just cut off from those victims and they don't really matter. The public don't come forward. The same resources aren't spent on it. The last of those street sex workers who died was a lady called Emma Caldwell. And Emma Caldwell came from a really lovely family, and her family went on Crime Watch, and they gave, you know, public statements. They were listened to. They were just a nice family. They were very likeable, and you know, there were pictures of Emma as a young girl, and Emma was very pretty, you know, and she looked vulnerable as well, and you know, she was very sympathetic, and that was great. I mean, a lot of resources were spent on trying to find the killer there. It was cack-handed. It was very badly handled. I think there's a universal acceptance of the fact that that went nightmarishly wrong. What they did was, I think the 3 senior officers had all come from, by that time, a surveillance background. So they used a lot of surveillance on the wrong people, basically. They bugged a Turkish cafe. They decided it was these Turkish guys. They bugged a Turkish cafe, and they got hundreds of hours of recordings of these guys saying things like, "We need to bury the lady's down," just things like that. And they arrested the guys and put them in Berlin. And then the tapes were sent to the defence when the case was brought, and they got them translated. And their translator said, they're not saying that at all. And also, that's a very well-known Turkish card game, Get the Lady Down. And so, you know, they'd misunderstood basically everything. And those guys, some of those guys actually got payments from the police for mishandling of that. And, you know, amongst street sex workers, or amongst sex workers now, a lot of people who work in that area were saying, if they had investigated the previous cases of unsympathetic people, they would have been in a better position to identify the killer here. And I think that's really true. I mean, I think, you know, if we treat people as if they're not part of the wider community, the wider community loses out. And that is the whole point of that, is that, you know, there's a cluster of behaviours that we could have identified far earlier if we'd been on point, if we'd done a better job of the original investigations in the other cases. And you know, so we're losing out. It's not just that these families are crying out for justice after all this time. We're actually the ones who are losing out as well. So anyway, the story is that Margo is a doctor and she loves the NHS and she's all the good things. I actually wrote this before COVID. I didn't know that the NHS was going to be like a universal value. It's so lovely for you know, all the clapping and everything. It's so lovely to know that we all share that value and we all think that's dead important and it's the best of us. So she goes to meet her family, and eventually they turn up very late, and it's her auntie, it's not her mum. Her mum was killed by a stranger. Well, she was a street sex worker in the 80s, and her auntie says, you know, no one really cared about your mum, and I've really only come to meet you because I want you to investigate it, and you know, and I'm hoping you'll do a better job because you're middle class. And Margo thinks she's got a lot going on. She's pregnant. She's just split up with her partner because she thinks he's going to be a terrible dad. Her mum's died. I think that those points in your life are the points where you do go looking for your family of origin, or where you do, you know, make big decisions about your identity and those big turning points in your life. But she thinks this is too much for me, and she decides just to leave it. But then she starts getting letters from the killer, and they start sending her things that belong to her mother and that were taken from her on the night that she died. So she's really dragged into it, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with it because it's so much easier just to look away. And I think it's much easier for all of us just to look away from that. And she starts to investigate, and she does a very kind of bad job about it. And ultimately she has to decide if she's going to do anything about it, because, you know, it's one thing to express an interest, but it's another thing to actually do something about it. And she becomes aware that she's being followed as well, and it's really creepy. And you know, there are passages in it from the killer who's watching her and following her around. And I really wanted to put the perspective of a misogynist on the page, because we talk about misogyny as if it's sort of free floating spores or something like that, but we all know what it sounds like and we all know what it looks like, and we very rarely look at it. And you know, I think in books like crime novels where you can have a lot of violence, I think we can look at something like that. I think we can look racism in the face in crime fiction in a way that's very difficult to do in other forms. Although what we can't do is swear. There's a really strange thing in crime fiction is that you'll often, you never get complaints about violence. Sometimes you get complaints from people saying it wasn't violent enough, but no one ever says that was too violent. I don't know what you think you're doing in your crime novels, but people do routinely write to you and say, I couldn't believe the number of F-bombs that you put in that book, which is quite weird. Actually, lots of people are lots of people on the right are very angry at Trump for using swear words, not for putting children in cages, but or any of his other crimes, but they're absolutely furious about the language. It's a really strange kind of line in the sand. But yeah, so I really wanted to represent that, because I think that's really important that we look at where that comes from. So so I met Nanette Pollock, the police officer, who I wrote to her and I said, do you know, I would just love to meet you and quiz you and ask you about it. And the chapter where I go and meet her is in the book. Although it's very heavily fictionalised. We had really interesting conversations, and we had a lot of conversations about the difference between crime fiction and crime facts. So for example, all the women who were killed in that spate of killings, I was going to use their names for other characters in the book, and I meant it as a homage to those women, and I meant it as a way of memorialising them and showing that, you know, I was aware of what had happened to them. And Nanette Pollock said, you can't do that. She's a real cop, do you know what I mean? She just tells you what she thinks. She said, no, you can't do that, because some of those family members don't know what happened to that person. They're going to see the name and it's not right. And she said, you're exploiting them. And I didn't have an argument against that. You know, that wasn't my intention, but it doesn't mean, there's what you do, and then there's how it's read by other people. And I thought there was, you know, even the faintest danger that she was right, I thought, right, okay, so I can't do that. She said, you know, it's interesting that people are so, she loves crime fiction, but she doesn't love true crime. And she said, you know, it's not an entertainment, it's people's lives, which I found really kind of fascinating, because she does do she helps a lot of crime fiction writers. She helps Liam McIlvanney. She was helping me, and she really went out of her way. And I have to say, that lady can make a sandwich. I mean, you know, bar none. Marquis, she'd give Marquis a run for the money. and just could not have been more accommodating, you know. And one of the things that really really touched me was, you know, I said to her, you know, if someone was related to one of the women who was killed, would you recognise them if they looked a lot like them? And she said, oh, she would, because she had pictures of those women above her desk for years and years. So they were always in her mind, those unsolved cases. While Nanette and I were in contact, one of the cases came up and we went to see the case together. And what happened was a woman had been murdered and they got DNA off her body, which is a very difficult thing to do because actually, you know, street sex work is a contact sport. So if you are touching people all the time, you will have a lot of DNA on you. And but they managed to get DNA from the killer. They were pretty sure it was from the killer, and they put it on file. Couldn't find anybody. Couldn't find a match for it anywhere, and they just put it on file. 20 years later, now there was CCTV of that woman in the city centre walking away with the man, and the man who was in the video had subsequently gone back to India. So we'd spent 10 years trying to get that guy to come back from India, and he kept disputing it. And eventually we managed to get, I'm saying we, I mean Scotland, you know, there's the fiscal service. Eventually they managed to get an extradition agreement for the guy. And almost exactly the same time, a Glasgow man was in a fight in a takeaway. He's a Chinese, he ran a Chinese takeaway, and there was some sort of stramash, and he had to give a DNA sample because you routinely have to do that. And it was a match. It was a guy, no one had any idea that this guy was in the frame. They didn't know that he knew her or anything like that. And they arrested him and he pled guilty. And Nanette and I went to see the trial. Well, it was a sentencing diet, really. You know, it was like he was found guilty, and it was absolutely fascinating. The families who were present in the audience, they all knew her, and they were all really touched that she was there. And that was so interesting to see somebody with that kind of commitment to the families who'd suffered that kind of loss, and the fact that those people felt so abandoned, you know, and they were a family. You know, it was very touching. It was very touching to see, and the fiscal and the defence had an agreed upon narrative, they call it. So they talked through where the woman came from, you know, all the struggles she'd had in her life, how she'd overcome them, you know, how she'd suffered from addiction, what her hopes and fears were. It was really, you know, it was very moving. Actually, it felt more like a eulogy than a trial. And it was a real privilege to see, and it made it very, very real. Anyway, the book really it became more and more disjointed the more I went on, and a lot of the ideas that I had at the very beginning didn't work, and it became more and more fictionalized because I started to think, you know, if it was 30 years before, maybe if these murders had happened 30 years before, I could have just written a straightforward true crime. But because I think we do have a responsibility to those families, and we do have a responsibility to the women who died, and to all the people who died in the heroin epidemic of the 80s and 90s. We really don't talk about that missed generation very much in Glasgow, and we really should. You know, people in the States are starting to talk about the crack epidemic that happened over there and the effect that had. But when things like that happen to social subgroups like people of colour in the States, like, you know, lower working class families here who are already struggling, we tend not really to talk about them as social phenomenon. We talk about them as a social nuisance. And it's who are the police there for? You know, now one of the things that Nanette told me was that when she started in the police, and she's on film saying this in a documentary about the police, she said, you know, that street sex workers were not regarded as people by the police. And really it was, she wouldn't say this, but it was people like her coming in and really taking it seriously and really attempting to do something about it that made the framing of that very, very different. So the whole thing was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating journey. Now I've got some questions from readers. Do you find it easy to enter into a criminal's mind? Asks Davy of Bearsden. I feel like a DJ on the radio. No, I don't actually. No, because I think most people who commit offences, particularly offences of violence, are frightened, and I'm quite often frightened, and I'm sure that's something we all share now that COVID's about. It's been quite an alarming time, it's been quite a frightening time, and I think the question that really interests me about crime fiction is why? Why would somebody do that? What? Trying to understand, trying to empathise with people who do bizarre or awful things, you know, trying to make sense of it. And I think there's always a way into somebody's mind. It's not that you share their values, because I don't think most people who commit these kinds of offences have a value system. You know, when we talk about serial killers, we often talk about, you know, what they make of the world, and, you know, it's the 7 deadly sins because they're dead religious or whatever, or, you know, mostly it's just chaotic people who don't get caught the first time, and they go on and commit it again. In fact, there is one theory that serial killers are suffering from PTSD, and they can't quite assimilate the fact that they've done what they've done, so they just repeat the behaviour over and over again as a way of trying to understand it. So I don't really find it particularly difficult to get. I find crimes of avarice I actually find quite difficult to understand, you know, like white collar crime and people who already have an abundance and just don't ever feel like it's enough. I don't really understand that, although, you know, being a lot better off than I ever used to be, I find I'm more tight now, and maybe that's a wee insight into that kind of crime. I find I'm less willing to give to charity. I mean, I do, but, you know, I don't know if it's about getting older, or if it is that the more money you get, the less money you want to give, or the more money you get, the less rich you feel. I don't know. I don't know what that's about, but maybe other people feel that way too. So I'm starting to kind of understand that. But if life is nothing, it's it's a striving to understand other people, isn't it? The next question is, why do you think so many of the best contemporary crime writers are Scottish? And that's Karen from Alexandria. Well, that's a brilliant question. I think we're all legging each other on. And I think when you read other Scottish crime fiction writers, it really makes you up your game, because you think, God, you know, they're questioning the integrity of the procedure. They're using a lot of forensics. They're really pushing that forward. You know, there are absolutely brilliant writers in Scotland. One of the really lovely things, and I do think this comes from Val McDermott and Ian Rankin, and people like Craig Robertson and Stuart McBride and Alex Gray, and, you know, a whole lot of people who work really hard at organising things and getting us all together, and they really set the tone. So the atmosphere between us is very kind, and, you know, crime fiction writers read a lot of crime fiction, and we love crime fiction. I mean, it really is a passion, and so you know, we do support one another. There's a writer called Gordon Brown who when Bloody Scotland was being organised, he arranged for unpublished crime writers to get to do a reading before the published crime writers went on to do their reading. And that kind of thing brings other people up with you. Gordon writes as Morgan Cry, by the way. If you haven't heard his name, you will have heard his name, but obviously he's getting mistaken for another Gordon Brown. You know, things like that just bring us all up together. And I do believe that my experience of crime fiction is that most crime fiction writers come from a different social strata than literary writers. And they're basically, we're low class, right? So we're strivers who love to write, but don't have enough family money, or, you know, we're not chartered accountants. Well, some of us are, but, you know, we don't have enough confidence maybe to spend 10 years writing an opus. What we're doing is trying to make a living at it. That is one of the great unspoken dirty secrets about the arts, is most artists spend a lot of their time trying to work out how on earth are they going to get to do this all day, because you only get good if you can do it all day. And how are you going to be able to make a living at it? Now, crime fiction, you can make a living at it. Literary fiction is very rare to make a living, especially now. It's very difficult to make a living. It's very easy to write. You could write the best book in the world and make $2,000 off it. That could be all you make off it. Whereas with crime fiction, you know, you can set out a series, you can set out a programme, you're going to do 5 in this series on the theme of blah, blah, blah. You can network, you can meet other people who write, you can support each other. You know, there's things like, you know, women in crime, you know, organisations where, you know, people with a common interest or a common theme get together and do readings together. So there's a lot of support there. And I think a lot of people who previously would either not have become writers because they couldn't make a living at it, and we've all got bills, haven't we? They would not have been able to write, and they become crime fiction writers. I think people who would have written literary fiction and, you know, been swallowed up by that. It used to be a living literary fiction, but it just isn't anymore. Those people are writing crime fiction. That's why you get such brilliant crime fiction. And basically egging each other on. So I think that's why there's so many brilliant crime fiction writers coming up in Scotland now. Which writers have an influence on how you write? On how I write. Now that's interesting, because stylistically I'm very given to purple prose, and you know, my aim is always to write clean sentences. And the people I'm influenced by right at this moment, there's a writer called Curtis Sittenfeld. I don't know how to pronounce her name. And she wrote a book called Rodham, and she wrote a book called, she wrote 2 books of short stories. One was called You Think It and I'll Say It, and the last one was called Help Yourself. Now Help Yourself, if you can't find that, I found it in the self-help section in Waterstones because nobody really knows it. She's a huge bestseller, and she's a beautiful writer. She's so clean. That's my dream, is to write clean sentences that your eye just slides across, you know. For content, I'm very influenced by people who come at things obliquely. So there's a writer called Bulgakov, and he wanted to write about Soviet Russia, right? So instead of writing a sort of Orwell book about Animal Farm or whatever, or Soviet Russia, or in fact it predates Animal Farm, his book, he wrote a book called Heart of a Dog, and I can't tell you how many people have bought that book for. Nobody likes it as much as me. I think it's an absolutely amazing book, and it's about a street dog, and it's seen from the dog's point of view. And the dog is adopted by a professor, and the professor gives the dog, does an operation and gives it the pituitary gland and the testes of a human being, and the dog becomes a quasi-human being, and it's about lifting the proletariat up. And then the dog gets a job as a cat strangler, and it smells of cat spay all the time, and it starts demanding rights in the housing and in the flat that they share, and it starts breaking things and being awkward and questioning the professor, and the professor tries to do an operation to make it go back, which is, it's an analogy about Stalinism, about how, you know, when you know, it's one thing to want to raise the proletarian up, but it's another thing to tolerate how messy they are. And you know, I loved that book so much. It really affected me, because I thought it was such an oblique, and it's not a perfect analogy, which is what's so great about it, is it doesn't just fit perfectly. It's a story in and of itself, and I really loved that. And I love the idea of doing political writing in a kind of fantasy, you know, or crime fiction type way, or looking at, you know, big social issues through quite a familiar kind of format. Alicia in Clydebank says, do you consider yourself to be a feminist writer? Yes, I do, and I always have. And when I started out in the late 90s, being a feminist was quite a kind of awkward thing to be. You know, people would say to me, they would whisper it actually, they'd say, are you a feminist? And I would say, yes, I am a feminist, but I'm you know, the types of feminists that everybody hates, you know, the ones that are really bullshit and, you know, really angry all the time and make everybody, that's the kind of feminist I am. So, but it's not such a big deal now to say that you're a feminist, but I do think men and women are equal, and I do think that, you know, we should have equal money for equal work, we should have equal protection of the law, and I think everybody benefits from that. And you know, I think when I started writing and I had female protagonists who were doing things, people thought it was a bit odd, and that was why they asked me if I was a writer, because it was always women. But I mean, I am a woman, and you do see it from your point of view, and And, you know, not that long ago, somebody said to me, do you not think it's a bit of a cliche having a female protagonist, which I thought was fantastic. Do you know, that's how far we've come, because it was a really odd thing to do. So myself, Val McDermott, Sarah Paretsky, Laura Lippman, Megan Abbott, Alifair Burke, all these women, we all come from the same tradition, which is, you know, we read crime fiction, we loved crime fiction, we knew it was women who were reading crime fiction, but all the active characters were men. And we are part of a wave of feminist crime fiction, and basically we've been successful because you know, a lot of crime fiction is about you know, the macho-ness of law enforcement and challenging all that, and a lot of male writers are writing in that style as well now, and I think that's all to the good. Now, David from Dumbarton asks, how much research do you do for a novel? The Less Dead features the lives of sex workers. Was it a challenge to get information about the reality of their lives? I do loads of research. I love research because it means I don't have to write, and I find you know, writing is actually graft, and no one likes graft. I mean, you feel great once you've done it, but you don't. You know, no one wants to sit down and think and write something and then have to read it over and say, oh, that's absolute rubbish. So I do love doing research. And I actually, you know, I didn't find it a challenge to find out what sex workers' lives were like, because I've got friends who are sex workers. There was an interview with a sex worker in the States recently, and she said with cam work, which is, you know, cameras and all that kind of thing, and internet work, it's very common for people to do sex work now when they're broke. And she said, you know, you will know a sex worker, and if you don't know a sex worker, it's because they don't feel safe to tell you they're a sex worker, which I thought was fascinating, actually. And I felt very privileged when anyone opens up and tells me that they've done that work. I feel very privileged, because it means they trust me, you know, and they know that I'm not going to be judgy or anything like that. And I'm not. I mean, I just don't. Yeah, I do judge people, but not about that. So I didn't find that hard, and I sat down with friends and I got them to answer questions. But I mean, it was historical, so I had to find some quite old friends, some storied women, to tell me about their experience, and it's something I've been thinking about for a really, really long time. One of the things I love doing in crime fiction is looking at people who do not get proper protection. And so that's a story, you know, psychiatric patients who can't go to the police because they just think the police will think they're mental and won't listen to them. You know, vulnerable people, you know, people who are engaged in dealing drugs who can't go to the police or feel that they can't call on the police, and street sex workers and sex workers, you know, indoor sex workers as well. So I didn't find it particularly hard to find out those things. And also, I tell you what, see in the Mitchell, see if you're doing anything historical, they've got microfiches of all the newspapers at the time. And if you go in there and you start scrolling through the 1980s newspapers, you find things like adverts for B-jams and big full page adverts for cigarettes and things like that. And it really takes you back to the time, you know, really takes you back to the time. And, you know, it's really quite stark. It gives you a real flavour of the time. So that's another type of research. And also walking around Glasgow, because most of my books are set in Glasgow, and just getting the geography of things is a lovely thing to do, because sometimes you'll realise there isn't a shop anywhere near this place, and that tells you a lot about an area. And I usually try and work out where everybody lives before I start telling a story, because that geography will really change the way people relate to one another, or how they see where they live or feel about themselves. So I sat down with a great big long list of questions and quizzed people. I went to Roots Out of Prostitution, the cafe that I was talking about before, where people could go and get a shower and leave their bags and stuff like that. That shut its doors. In 2001, Glasgow City Council decided that their money was all going to go on trying to get people out of street sex work, and they didn't want people to use that. They thought it was facilitating street sex work. So basically it's a service that tells you how to get out of street sex work now, rather than somewhere that you can go for support just to continue working in the streets. And so I went down there and interviewed them for quite a long time. And I interviewed a lot of policymakers about the fact that in Scotland we redefine sex work as an act of gendered violence against women, and that is not a definition that's been adopted anywhere else, and it has fundamentally changed the way that we police all sex work, because the only thing you can do is try and help somebody to stop. One of the consequences of that has been that, you know, if sex workers are working in a flat, they're not allowed to have a pal there with them, keep them safe. You know, there's a recent case up in Aberdeen of a lady who was in a flat with a guy and she thought he was going to murder her, and she phoned her pal in Belfast instead of phoning the police. I mean, you know, with the best intentions in the world, these things often have consequences that we couldn't have anticipated. But people were very, you know, they were very open about it, and they were very open to discuss it with me, and even be disagreed with, you know, and, you know, for me to say, look, I have friends who are sex workers and don't agree with that, and, you know, they were really pretty amazing, actually. So, it was, you know, the research was absolutely brilliant. I loved doing it. How different is writing for graphic novels than traditional fiction? Oh, wow. And this is from Anne Louise from Govan. Do you feel additional pressure when it involves adapting the work of a well-known writer? Well, I'll start with the first part. Graphic novels are fascinating to write, because you have to draw the page, you have to draw out the panels, you know, if you want them to be ovals, or you want them to be one square and then a big square, or you want it to be a full page splash or a half page splash or whatever, and you want the story to unfold over the course of those panels. And then you have to describe everything that goes on in that one little picture, and then you have to put in the dialogue and stuff like that. It's very different. You can't hide with an internal monologue because everything's shown. So quite often in crime fiction, people go off and have a bit of a think about things, and often, you know, on the basis of clues that you've set out, arrive at conclusions they couldn't possibly have arrived at. But it's, you know, the scene where the character gets drunk and comes to a conclusion, it's often sort of logic jumps in that. You could never do that in a comic. You have to be very clear, it has to be very clean. You're basically showing the skeleton of the story, so it has to absolutely make sense within its own world. And yeah, I do feel additional pressure when adapting the work of a well-known writer, because I did The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo graphic novels, and I have to say I was awful glad he was dead, because there was so much I had to cut out to fit it into the space. So I actually did feel additional pressure, and I was kind of guessing what he thought was important about the story, you know. It says, also, graphic novels can have a different type of audience from other writing. Do you think that makes a difference to the way you write? Well, they have a very, very different audience. And when I first started writing comics, I think it was the year 2000, I wrote Hellblazer for a year, and it was quite hostile, you know. I mean, because I was a woman, and, you know, people were quite shocked that a woman was writing comics, and that a woman was writing Hellblazer, which was quite a macho comic. And but there wasn't the internet then, so, you know, they were hostile, and I found out about it 5 years later. I don't care. But by the time The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo came out, the audience had changed completely. I mean, it was really like 2/3 men, 1/3 women, and it was a very, very different type of audience. So, for example, I did an event in Wigtown, and I mentioned farting, and a woman in the front row gasped. And then 2 days later, I was in Helsinki doing a thing about The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and someone asked me to sign her boob with Sharpie. So, you know, different audience, and different responses. Anyway, I've chuntered on, but I hope you really enjoy Book Week Scotland, and I hope you come to all the events. And thanks very much for staying with me to the end. Cheerio!